Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave with Evil Eye Games. In today's video, I want to go ahead and continue on with our third-person cover shooter. And at this point, we have a mostly complete game. At least all of the basic skeleton things are in place. So at this point, we can kind of start adding things into our game to make it look a little bit better. So right now, the way we have things that work is that when we end up killing our enemy characters, they end up just disappearing. We delete them from existence. So if I go ahead and hit play, and I've just loaded up the test map here, and I just have two guys in place. So if I go ahead and I kill this dude, he just, bloop, disappears. Same thing with this guy right here. He's gone. So what I want to do is I want to actually make the enemies ragdoll when we kill them. So in order to start talking about ragdolling, I'm going to go into our characters folder and I'm going to go into our mannequin folder. And inside of the mesh folder here, there are three things. There's the actual skeletal mesh, there is a skeleton file, and then there's a physics asset file. And we want to look at the physics asset file. And I touched on this briefly before, but basically these capsules that are around the character here are what provide interaction and collision with other things in the environment. The mesh itself does not provide any collision. Now the UE4 mannequin that came with the animation packs is actually pretty well set up. So if I go ahead and up at the top here I hit simulate, it's going to completely do physics-based collision. And we can kind of play with it. If we hold down the control key and right click on the skeleton, we can move him around a little bit. And you'll see that he reacts pretty realistically for a ragdolled body. So we can kind of move him around and test everything out and see how it works. Now, if you've provided your own character, if you created your own mesh, or if you've gotten an asset from an asset store or got it from some other source, the probability is that the physics asset has not been set up. And I actually have another project open where I ended up just completely destroying the physics asset and having Unreal Engine regenerate it by itself. And when Unreal Engine regenerates the physics assets, it goes ahead and it takes every single bone that the skeleton has and applies a capsule to it. And this doesn't work very well. So if we go ahead and hit the simulate button here, you'll see that it is just an absolute mess. It doesn't work out very well. So if you're going to be providing your own custom character using a third-party character, you're going to want to go ahead and create a physics asset for it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and provide a link down below to a video that Epic does where they walk through the process of creating a physics asset for a character. And it's a very good video. I think it's about a half an hour long, but it goes step by step as he actually makes the physics asset so that it'll work in a realistic manner. So if you have a custom character, I would advise you go take a look at that video first and set up some physics assets for your characters. So back in our game, we're going to go ahead and we're going to open up our enemy character blueprint. And when we get into our enemy character blueprint, we're going to look at where we take damage because we're going to want to do this after the character is dead. So from here, we take damage. We have a sequence where we first set our character into combat, and then we go ahead and calculate our health. And then if we're dead, we stop firing our weapon. We go ahead and update the game state, and then we just destroy the actor. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of this destroy actor. And what we're going to want to do is we want to go ahead and take our mesh and enable the physics simulation. So we're going to need a reference to our mesh. So up in our components tab here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag off of our mesh onto our graph, and we'll get a reference to our character's mesh. Now we're going to drag off of our mesh, and we're going to search for set all bodies, simulate physics. And we're going to go ahead and plug this in at the end here. And we're going to set this new simulate to true. So let's go ahead and compile and save, and we'll hit play and see what happens. So now when I go ahead and kill this enemy, he falls through the floor. And you're going, oh God, why does he fall through the floor? Well, this has to do with the collision with the mesh. So if we click on our actual mesh here, and we look at the details to the right, under our collision, we're using the collision preset that we created for character mesh, and the collision enabled is for query only. It doesn't use physics collision. So we're going to have to make a modification to our character mesh collision settings. So we're going to go to Edit. We're going to go to our project settings. We're going to find collision, and we're going to drop down our presets here. And we're going to find our character mesh. And we're going to go ahead and click on Edit. And we're going to have to switch over our query only to collision enabled query and physics. And we're going to go ahead and hit accept. And I'm going to go back to our main menu and we're going to hit play to test it out. So now, if I can get over to one of these guys, I'm going to go ahead and kill this one. And you see that he just kind of slumps over. So if I go over to this guy right here, and I shoot him, they both kind of just slump in place. So our physics collision is actually working appropriately. But now we need to add a little bit of force to the reaction in order to create a more realistic effect instead of just slumping over. So we're going to go back into our base enemy character blueprint. Following our set all bodies to simulate physics, we want to grab our mesh, and we want to search for add impulse at location. So we're going to get this add impulse at location function. And I'm just going to put a couple of these pins in place here. And for this, we have an impulse, which is the actual force in the form of a vector. We have a location where we want to apply that force, and we have a bone name. Now, what we can do with this is we're going to have to give it an impulse force. So, the way that I want to do this is I want to pass it through our event take damage. So the weapon is going to actually define the force. So if we remember how our weapons work, our weapon has some set variables. And when we spawn a projectile, we pass some information into the projectile. And then when the projectile impacts on the enemy, it passes some information to the enemy via interfaces. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up our base projectile blueprint. And we have a function in here to set the damage info. And we're taking in our damage min, our damage max, and our crit chance. So we're going to create a new variable. And we're going to call this the impact force. And I'm going to make this a float. And then for our set damage info here, I'm going to go ahead and add a new input. And we're just going to simply call this the impact force. And we're going to make it a float as well. And then we're simply going to drag our impact force in here. And we're going to go ahead and set it. And we're going to set it from this input force from the set damage info. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this. And we have in our graph here, when we on component hit, we go ahead and we push out this information via our take damage interface. So we're going to have to modify our interface a little bit so it passes the appropriate information to the enemy character when it hits it. So we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to double click on our take damage here. And this will take us to our take damage interface. And we can go ahead and modify it at this point. But I want to take a look real fast within our base enemy character here. Now we're already pushing through the hit bow name. So we can actually drag and connect this hit bow name down to our bow name at add impulse at location. And of course we can add a few pins in here just to make it look a little bit neater. But we're also going to need an impulse force. So in order to calculate our impulse force that we're putting through, we want it to come through as a vector. So back in our damage interface here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new input. Go ahead and call this our impact vector. And we're going to go ahead and set this to a type of a vector. And we can go ahead and compile and save this. And if we go back into our blueprint here, we're going to see that our damage interface has been modified. And we now have this impact vector. So in order to calculate this impact vector that we want, we have in here an impact normal from our break hit result. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our impact normal and we're going to go ahead and search for a multiplication. And we want to multiply a vector times a float. And we're going to multiply it by our impact force. Then we're going to go ahead and plug this into our impact vector. And we can just go ahead and make it look a little bit neater by adding in some reroute nodes. And what we're essentially doing here is this break hit result returns this value, which is an impact normal. And what this impact normal does is it's a direction from the center of our projectile to where it hits on whatever it collides with. And the normal part of it basically provides a 1 centimeter length of a vector. And a 1 centimeter length of a vector isn't a very strong force. So that's why we're taking an impact force and multiplying it by this vector. So we're giving it a direction, and then we're multiplying it by a force. If you've ever dealt with any physics before, you're going to be very familiar with vectors having two values, being a direction and an actual amount of force. And then we're going to go ahead and we're passing that into our damage interface. So if we actually travel to our base enemy character now, and we take a look at our event take damage, we now have this impact vector that's coming through. And we're going to take this impact vector, and we're going to go ahead and plug it into the impulse. And then I am going to go ahead and put in some reroute nodes so we can kind of make things less of a mess. And what this is going to do is it's going to create an impulse force based on the vector that we calculated within the projectile at a specific bow name. Now you can also use a location, and if you use a location, the location is going to override the bow name. So you can do it either way. For example, if we look at the projectile here, and we get the impact point that provides a vector location of where it actually impacts with whatever it impacts. So you can use this impact point and feed that through and go ahead and plug it into the location as well. So for our cases, just applying at the bone is going to be perfectly acceptable. So the last thing we need to do now is we need to set the actual impact force within our projectile. So I'm going to compile and save this, and we're going to go ahead and open up our base weapon blueprint. And when we're looking at our base weapon blueprint, we're going to look at the point where we actually fire the weapon. So let's see here. When we fire the weapon, we go ahead, we play an animation, we calculate our shooting information, we spawn our projectile, and then we go ahead and set the damage info in the projectile here. So we're going to have to go ahead and create a new variable, and we're going to call this our impact force. And I'm going to go ahead and make it a float. And we're going to plug this impact force into our set damage info. And then we can go ahead and set a value for this. So we're going to go ahead and compile. And then for the impact force, I'm just going to start off with a force of 10,000. And we'll see how that works. So I'll go ahead and compile and save. And actually, I'll go ahead and hit save all. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and give it a test. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And I'm going to run up to one of these guys so we can see it pretty clearly. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shoot him in the leg right here. And you'll see that he kind of reacts to the force of where we apply it. And let me go ahead and I'm going to fire at this guy if I can get him to stop. And I'm going to kind of shoot him in the head. And you'll see that now once he's dead, he reacts to the force of the weapon. Now, the one thing I'm noticing here is that it's moving in the opposite direction of the projectile. So, when we take a look at our, let's see where it is, the base projectile and the impact normal, so the vector here from the impact normal actually travels from the hit point on whatever is hit back to our component. So if we want to create a more accurate direction here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this connection. And we're going to, from our trace start, we're going to search for a vector, and we're going to get the direction vector. And we're going to do it from our trace start to our trace end. And then we're going to go ahead from our return value, and we're going to normalize. And this is going to go ahead and take the vector from where we started our trace to where we ended our trace and make it a 1 centimeter vector force. And we can go ahead and plug this into our multiplier over here. And let's go ahead and compile and save, and we'll hit play again. And if we go ahead and start shooting at this guy, he falls away in the correct direction. So once again, I'm going to shoot this guy in the leg here, and his leg sort of flies out from behind him. And likewise, when we shoot the guys who are on the ground, they move away from us now. And we can kind of shoot them around and pulse them around the map as such. So essentially what we're doing when we go ahead and do this is we're starting off with our weapon. So in our base weapon, we have a variable that's an impact force. And you can vary this based on the different weapons. So if you create child weapons of our base weapon, you can set the impact force differently for different weapons. But when we go ahead and spawn our projectile and we go ahead and set our damage info, we're feeding this impact force into our set damage info. So inside of our projectile, when we set damage info, it sets all of our variables in here and sets an impact force within our projectile. So when our projectile actually collides with something, we go ahead and we find the direction of travel of our projectile from where it started to where it impacts with something. We go ahead and normalize it to make it a 1 centimeter vector. And then we go ahead and multiply it by the impact force that is fed to the weapon. Or I'm sorry, it's fed to the projectile from the weapon. So this creates a vector of a certain magnitude, and we feed this through our take damage interface. So inside of our enemy, when the event take damage is actually called upon, we go ahead and we feed that impact vector down to an add impulse at location, and we go ahead and perform this impulse upon the mesh at the bone that was hit. In the next video, I want to go ahead and get into doing a dissolve effect so it looks like the enemies disintegrate when they die. But that's going to complete today's video. So if you guys have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and leave them down below, or you can head over to my Facebook page and message me over there. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.